Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to get started. I think we have a critical mass this afternoon. My name is Sarah Vogel. I'm the Senior Vice President for Health at EDF, and I really want to welcome and thank you all for taking time out of your busy day to join us for today's webinar on EDF's new Cumulative Risk Assessment Framework. Just a quick note that we are recording this session, and we'll be making that recording available later. So EDF developed this new cumulative risk assessment framework as a tool to spur and support EPA to conduct comprehensive assessments of chemicals that take into account the multiple exposures experienced by people, particularly those living in communities with a concentration of pollution sources. So for decades, environmental justice leaders have documented the disproportionate exposures experienced within their communities. And they really, alongside a number of academics, some of who are joining us today, have shown how unjust policies of land use, transportation, and housing have resulted in communities that experience a host of pollution sources related to industrial areas, waste sites, transportation hubs and corridors that result in significant exposures to many different pollutants in the air, the water, food, homes, and workplace. And these exposures, combined with social stressors such as racism, poverty, and lack of access to healthcare, further contribute to higher risks of disease and disability, from cancers and heart disease to poor birth outcomes and childhood asthma. Yet this reality is largely ignored under the current chemical management system, which evaluates risk of each chemical in isolation without taking into account this broader context. And I'd posit that while this may be difficult or really uncomfortable to acknowledge, to continue that practice in the face of this reality is to perpetuate an injustice. But the good news is that we have the tools, the knowledge, and the legal directive to make some really important changes. And a key step in that process is to integrate a cumulative, comprehensive approach to evaluating chemical risk. So EDF has taken a step to develop a cumulative risk assessment tool in an effort really to provide a practical pathway for applying comprehensive evaluations, specifically within the context of the framework of the Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA. So TSCA, as many of you may know, gives EPA the authority to evaluate and regulate the production, use, and disposal of chemicals. It's unique among US environmental laws because it requires both a holistic consideration of chemical risks and special consideration of those who may be at greater risk because they are more susceptible to a chemical's effects or are more highly exposed. And yet, to date, EPA's risk assessments have fallen short of meeting that requirement. And I think, and I hope, as you'll see, that EDF's cumulative risk assessment framework describes how EPA can scale up from its current more narrow risk evaluations to ultimately yield a fully inclusive, just, and comprehensive assessment of cumulative risk that matches the promise and requirements of TSCA. So I'm really pleased to have a number of speakers with us today to dig into this. First up, to provide an overview of this framework, we're joined by Dr. Lariah Edwards, a postdoc fellow with EDF and an associate research scientist at Columbia University. Her presentation on the framework will be followed by Professor Devon Payne-Sturges from the University of Maryland, who will discuss the work that she and Professor Deborah Cory-Slechta from the University of Rochester Medical Center have done on the available methodologies and approaches for conducting assessments of cumulative exposures and impacts. So after we hear from our first two speakers, we're going to hold time for question and answer session. And at that time, Professor Cory-Slechta will also join the panel. We ask that you type questions into that Q&A box that should be at the bottom of your screen or with your apps, depending on your Zoom configuration. I'm going to be moderating that discussion, and we hope we'll be able to get to as many questions as we can. So thank you again for joining us. I'm going to now turn it over to Dr. Lariah Edwards.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you guys all for joining us today to talk about cumulative risk. Next slide. Start with a bit of background, really kind of reiterating what Sarah just lovely, very laid out lovely. We are exposed to multiple chemicals in our environment. However, we all have different exposure profiles. It is well known that people of color and persons with lower income and other groups are disproportionately exposed to environmental chemicals. At the same time, these same communities are likely to experience not only higher chemical exposures, but they're also likely to be more susceptible to the effects of these chemicals. This is a result of a number of factors, some being age and others being other stressors, like exposure to other chemicals or experiencing racial discrimination, and these all contribute to health disparities. Next slide. So the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA, gives EPA the authority to regulate chemicals in a way that is protective of public health. Chemicals that are determined to present an unreasonable risk by the agency can be regulated in some sort of way, whether that be those chemicals being banned or restricted. So 40 years after it was passed, TSCA was reformed, and the amendments to TSCA helped strengthen its ability to regulate chemicals. Some of the major improvements including explicit language for the protection of vulnerable subgroups, which we'll talk about more shortly. Additionally, chemicals will now be evaluated for risk based strictly on scientific criteria. Non-risk factors such as cost of regulating the chemical cannot be considered when EPA is trying to determine whether or not a chemical presents an unreasonable risk. So the amended updated language in TSCA makes it unique at addressing the cumulative risks that chemicals pose. So TSCA calls for the holistic consideration of chemical risks. This means that the evaluation and management of risks across the full life cycle of a chemical should be considered. So for all known, intended, and reasonably foreseen uses. As mentioned previously, there is language requiring that specific potentially exposed or susceptible subpopulations be considered when EPA is determining whether or not a chemical presents an unreasonable risk. These subpopulations include infants, children, workers, and pregnant women. And in doing so, to make sure that vulnerable subpopulations are being protected, agencies should consider that these groups are also exposed to other stresses that need to be considered in their risk evaluation, because it is important to consider these things in trying to determine risk. TSCA also requires the use of best available science to evaluate the risk that chemicals pose to public health. So this supports the use of cumulative risk approaches where the science is sufficiently developed to do so. Next slide. So now turning to the framework. We developed the Cumulative Risk Assessment Framework, or the CRA framework, with all this in mind, that TSCA has the potential to address the cumulative risks that chemicals can pose to public health. So the framework is a model to conceptualize how current risk evaluations can be incrementally scaled up to be more comprehensive, more inclusive, and really just more protective for public health. The framework is presented as an inverted pyramid, which I'll show shortly, where each level describes a chemical risk evaluation. Levels near the top are more comprehensive chemical risk evaluations, meaning they include more stressors, chemical and non-chemical. The risk evaluations exemplified at these uppermost levels are also more scientifically robust and more protective for public health. We describe the framework within a report that also includes specific language from TSCA in support of using cumulative approaches. The report also includes links to references to illustrate the scope of the risk evaluation at each level and a list of resources that could be used to conduct the evaluation at each level. Next slide. So here is the CRA framework. As I described previously, each level of the framework describes a chemical risk evaluation, and each level builds on the previous, getting to our highest, utmost inclusive level, which is level 5. So with each level, we include additional factors, such as more chemicals and inclusion of non-chemical stressors. Furthermore, you will see that each level is more protective more effective at protecting public health as you move up towards the final top level of cumulative impacts. So at the bottom of the site, notice a web page. So we have created an interactive web page that includes the figure that lets you explore the scope of the risk evaluation discussed at each level. It also talks about the groups that are protected at each level and describes why this is more, why this level is better for protecting public health. The webpage also has a link to the full report where you can read the entire thing that I'll be discussing today. So for the rest of the presentation, I will give an overview of each of the levels. Next slide. So level 1, single-use risk, which is the evaluation of a single TSCA chemical use, including select sources and vulnerable subpopulations. So as the title suggests, this level focuses on the risk from a single chemical from specific uses of it. So these are specific TSCA uses of a chemical. In this level of the risk evaluation, only a subset of a chemical's conditions of use, hazards, and exposures are being evaluated, meaning that important sources of exposures are excluded, and combinations of exposures are also not assessed. So we've seen examples of these chemical risk assessments following the 2016 TSCA amendments. Ultimately, these assessments at this level were narrow in scope, which means that the risk was underestimated for the public. Next slide. So moving up the framework, we get to level 2. This builds on level 1 by adding in the consideration of all relevant conditions of uses for a single chemical. Risk evaluations at this level are also consider all vulnerable subpopulations, which is mandated under TSCA. So an example of this would be currently 1,3-butadiene is a chemical undergoing risk evaluation. An example of risk evaluation at this level 1 could be one where fence line communities, which are situated near rubber manufacturing plants, are considered as vulnerable subpopulations, because data has shown that these manufacturing plants disperse high levels of 1,3-butadiene, and communities that are situated near these facilities, such as communities in Greater Houston, are more exposed to higher concentrations of 1,3-butadiene than the general population. So failing to consider that there are communities out there that are highly exposed to these chemicals in the risk evaluation means you underestimate their risk. Next slide. So level 3, building on the risk evaluation outline in level 2, risk evaluations at this level also consider background sources of exposure. So this is an expanded risk evaluation. So background sources of exposures could include sources that fall outside of TSCA's direct regulatory authority, or exposures that can't be tied to a direct exposure source, but can be identified from, for example, biomonitoring data. The inclusion of background sources in the risk evaluation captures relevant real-world experiences that inform the true extent of risk posed chemical evaluated under TSCA. And importantly, it still fulfills TSCA's mandate to evaluate and manage risks across the full life cycle of a chemical. A relevant example is that currently DEHP and orthophthalate is undergoing risk evaluation by TSCA. A risk evaluation that fits the scope outline at this level would include the consideration that populations are exposed to phthalates from TSCA uses, such as use in electronics and paints and coatings, but also its use in food packaging and medical devices, which is outside of TSCA's direct regulatory authority and is covered by FDA. Next slide. Our level 4 is cumulative risk. So this is a building on level 3. We're calling cumulative risk this term to mean that it's complete assessment of risk from exposure to all chemicals or categories of chemicals linked to the same health outcome. This provides a more realistic snapshot of all of our lived experiences because we are not exposed to a single chemical at a time. So in TSCA, the law requires that the agency use the best available science in developing chemical risk evaluations, which could be argued in support of using a cumulative risk assessment approach where the science is sufficient to do so. So an example of this type of risk evaluation could be evaluating all of the 7 orthophthalates currently undergoing risk evaluation together as a class since many of these orthophthalates share similar exposure sources. In addition, many of these chemicals are linked to the same health effects, including male reproductive effects, which we will learn more about shortly. Next slide. Thank you. And the final level of the framework, we're calling cumulative impact. So this is a comprehensive evaluation of risks from co-exposures to non-chemical stressors and chemical stressors, all linked to the same health outcomes. So exposure to non-chemical stressors can occur at the individual level, the community level, or larger at the state or countrywide level. And biologically, there's a growing amount of literature that shows that these non-chemical stressors can contribute to the same health effects as chemical stressors, and they need to be accounted for in chemical risk evaluations. Otherwise, you risk underestimating risk. This is particularly important when trying to protect vulnerable subgroups, because as stated earlier, they're often exposed to both higher concentrations of a chemical while experiencing non-chemical stressors. So to leave that part out of the risk evaluation is to underestimate risk. And undoubtedly, this is the most complicated risk evaluation when quantitatively trying to account for non-chemical stressors. However, the science has shown that non-chemical stressors are modifying chemical disease associations. An evaluation at this level featuring orthophthalates might consider that stress plus exposure to phthalates leads to strong associations of preterm birth. So ultimately, as the title states, we see this as a tool to spur us forward and provide greater protection. Often current evaluations of chemicals fall short at reflecting individuals and communities' real lived experiences, which then leaves environmental justice communities at risk and unprotected. So increasingly comprehensive evaluations can protect the public. We hope that this framework can be used as a conceptual tool to show that more evaluations that are less comprehensive and fail to consider our relevant stressors are a detriment to public health. Furthermore, we hope this framework provides a model for moving towards more comprehensive evaluations in a way that is easy to see and show that is in fact achievable. Next slide. And now I'd like to continue on with the discussion of cumulative approaches. I will pass it on to Dr. Devon Payne-Sturges and Dr. Deborah Cory-Slechta.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Hope everyone can hear me. Yes, excellent. So again, my name is Dr. Devon Payne-Sturges, and along with my collaborator, Dr. Deborah Cory-Slechta, we are very pleased to share this presentation with you all this afternoon, which really builds upon a lot of what Dr. Edwards has just described. Next slide, please. So the EPA is currently conducting separate TSCA risk evaluations for 7 phthalates. And at the end of this evaluation, EPA must make a determination whether current uses and exposures present unreasonable risk. And if so, take regulatory action to eliminate such unreasonable risk. So as you heard, phthalates are highly abundant plastic additives. They're used primarily to soften materials and make them flexible. They're used in paints and coatings, in electronic parts, in building and construction materials. They're widely found in our foods, in medical devices and equipment, cleaning supplies, and even personal care products. So literally, phthalates are found in everything we use on a daily basis. And the scientific evidence shows that the entire group of phthalates can cause similar constellation of health problems. So EPA has the opportunity to incorporate a cumulative risk assessment as part of the current risk evaluation of these 7 phthalates. However, the agency has not signaled that it plans to do so. Next slide. So the objectives of this presentation are to highlight key features of our white paper, outlining an approach somewhat like a step-by-step guide that EPA could use to implement a cumulative risk evaluation for these 7 phthalates under TSCA. This approach is based on the traditional human health risk assessment paradigm and EPA's own 2003 framework for cumulative risk assessment, where cumulative risk is defined by EPA as the combined risks from aggregate exposures to multiple agents or stressors, which can be biological, chemical, physical, or even psychosocial, by all relevant routes of exposures and pathways and sources. The term cumulative risk assessment is defined by EPA as an analysis, characterization, and possible quantification of the combined risks to human health or the environment from multiple agents or stressors. Therefore, our approach also outlines how EPA could go about incorporating relevant non-chemical stressors into a cumulative risk evaluation of the 7 phthalates to the extent possible. And we also point to research priorities to facilitate a fuller consideration of non-chemical stressor exposures going forward. And lastly, we align our approach with the TSCA risk evaluation framework as shown in this slide. Next slide, please. So we argue that a cumulative risk evaluation of these phthalates is warranted. Human biomonitoring data shows widespread human exposure to a mixture of phthalates from those diverse sources that we just mentioned earlier, as well as disparities in exposure levels by race and ethnicity. Phthalates have similarities in chemical structure, metabolism, and biological activity. Further toxicological evidence has documented biological additivity of multiple phthalate exposures affecting common biological targets. So for example, Conley and colleagues from Old Gray's lab at EPA published a study where they looked at the effects of in utero exposure to a mixture of pesticides and phthalates in animal models. And these components were are each individually already known to produce male reproductive tract toxicity. And what they did was they looked at doses of these mixture components at fractions of their known individual, what we call no observed adverse effect levels, or NOELs. And they found that the combined exposures reduced fetal testis gene expression at 1/15 the NOELs, reduced fetal testis testosterone production at 1/8 the NOELs, reductions in anogenital distance, increased nipple retention and delayed puberty at 1/4 the NOELs, and severe effects such as genital malformation and reproductive tissue weight reductions at 1/2. So in other words, Conley et al. Demonstrated that you can get something from nothing, meaning toxic effects can occur even if each individual component in the mixture is below what we call a level of concern. So given the regulatory mandate that EPA consider potentially exposed or susceptible populations, otherwise people at an increased or higher risk of adverse health effects, whether by greater susceptibility or greater exposure, a cumulative risk approach or evaluation is warranted. To do so otherwise would underestimate risk. I do want to say here that it's important to point out that we are not the first ones to make this point or this argument, and this is not the first time that this argument has been made about phthalates. In fact, we can look back to 2008 to a report that the National Academies published on phthalates and cumulative risk assessment, the tasks ahead, which recommended back then that a cumulative risk assessment should be conducted to evaluate the combined effects of exposures to all phthalates for the very same reasons I'm just describing. And I also want to point out that many scientists and policy experts in the US and in Europe have been making these very same arguments. Next slide. So a cumulative risk evaluation for phthalates is doable. The methods already exist to assess the non-cancer health effects of chemical mixture exposures, as supported by the 3 documents I'm showing you here in the upper right-hand corner. I already mentioned the 2008 report, published by the National Academies. The US EPA has their own document that summarizes methods and tools and data sources for cumulative risk assessments. We also have results of a cumulative risk evaluation of phthalates by the Consumer Product Safety Commission's Chronic Hazard Advisory Panel on Phthalates, which was done for regulatory purposes. In fact, studies on the effects of mixtures on male reproductive development and phthalates provide one of the larger databases supporting the use of dose addition models for cumulative risk assessments. So in that 2014 report by the CPSC's Chronic Hazard Advisory Panel on phthalates, they found that roughly 10% of about the 5 million pregnant women in the US were at an increased risk for adverse male reproductive tract developmental effects associated with cumulative exposure to 5 phthalates. Now, this percentage actually increased to 21% of pregnant women when 10 additional chemicals associated with anti-androgenicity were also included in the cumulative risk evaluation. These 10 chemicals included BPA, fungicides, herbicides, DDE, and flame retardant chemicals. Next slide. So the purpose of this slide is to show that EPA is well aware of methods to assess risks of chemical mixtures. This chart is taken from EPA's 2021 PFAS Cumulative Risk Assessment Framework, and it even cites phthalates as the example for why you need to do and can conduct a cumulative risk assessment for regulatory decision making. So we recommend leveraging this knowledge, existing knowledge for the phthalates that are undergoing their risk evaluations, and use these dose addition methodologies that are listed here in this slide. Next slide. So we recommend using a common adverse health outcome as the organizing principle for the cumulative risk evaluation of phthalates, which is actually consistent with recommendations in the 2008 National Academies report. Such a strategy is really well suited for a component-based chemical mixtures risk assessment that assumes dose additivity. It also helps to determine the population groups for the exposure assessment and cumulative risk evaluation. So given the standard of care for the TSCA risk evaluation is to consider the potentially exposed or susceptible populations, we propose that the same approach be used to screen in additional chemical and non-chemical stressors for the cumulative risk assessment. Otherwise, in other words, what are the additional risk factors that can also act on the same biological pathways that converge on a common adverse outcome or health effect, through which the effects of the chemicals or chemicals undergoing the TSCA risk evaluations are mediated. Thereby, this would help establish that biological framework for additive effects. So for the purposes of this presentation, we focused on the well-studied male reproductive dysfunction effects that are common among the phthalates. So based on this common health outcome, we would recommend here that the population of concern would be women of childbearing age. From the animal and epi literature, we identified other chemical and non-chemical exposures and health conditions or comorbidities that also affect male reproductive tract development, as shown in this figure. While methods for cumulative risk evaluation of multiple chemical exposures are available, the inclusion of the non-chemical stressors, albeit essential, is a bit more challenging. Some of these challenges include approaches for combining heterogeneous data and the use and validation of proxy variables, especially for social stressors. We emphasize that there is a need to really begin critical discussions about how to approach these issues and overcome these challenges. But in the meantime, we did outline a few options for incorporating non-chemical stressors as part of either the dose response assessment or the exposure assessment or the cumulative risk characterization step for these phthalates. So for one example, an additional adjustment factor could be applied, akin to an uncertainty factor that are currently used in risk assessment to account for added susceptibility. An additional adjustment factor could be used to represent the effects of the unmeasured relevant non-chemical stressors or other chemicals or comorbidities when establishing the RFDs or reference doses for phthalates for use in a cumulative risk evaluation. Another option would be where there is evidence of effect modification or statistical interaction by a non-chemical stressor or other exposure, you could treat this as evidence of vulnerability and use that dose response information to identify points of departure or to derive reference doses for use in a cumulative risk assessment. We point to two examples of this approach. EPA has experience doing this. For example, in the recent external review draft of the 2021 policy assessment for the PMNACs, as well as a really excellent publication by Chari et al. Back in 2012 that also looked at this with regards to the lead NACs. Another option would be to treat the non-chemical stressor as an exposure itself and follow the existing risk assessment methods, assuming dose additivity. Now, where quantitative information might be limited, but it's still, the evidence might be suggestive of a health concern or enhancing the risk of a toxic chemical exposure, EPA could assess or describe the impact of these unmeasured relevant non-chemical or other chemical stressors qualitatively. Now, EPA has a lot of experience actually in describing unquantified health benefits when they are developing the regulatory impact analyses for different rulemaking. So EPA could tap into that experience here. There are expert elicitation methodologies that could be applied. Additionally, perhaps a qualitative scoring system that could address the likelihood and severity and magnitude of effects could be applied in this case, something akin to the hazard ranking scoring system that's currently in use for the Superfund program to deal with the non-chemical stressors. It's important to mention that there are other potential health effects of concern common to the phthalates beyond the male reproductive effects that we're focusing on here. And EPA should also consider conducting cumulative risk evaluations for those other health effects across all the phthalates, including any relevant non-chemical stressors. Next, please. So continuing with this argument that cumulative risk evaluation is doable for these phthalates, I just want to mention here that supporting information for a cumulative risk evaluation of phthalates can be leveraged from what EPA has already assembled in their scoping documents for the individual phthalates. With regards to exposure assessment, EPA is already familiar with methods for estimating human exposure to multiple chemicals, either using human biomonitoring data or using the exposure scenario approach. And just want to, of course, here reemphasize the importance of incorporating relevant non-chemical stressors to the extent possible. But I want to talk a little bit about well, how do we make the interpretation of these cumulative risk estimates? So quantitative outputs from a cumulative risk assessment based on dose additivity are either a hazard index or a margin of exposure. But we are suggesting that these that the criteria that are used, or criteria, the thresholds that are used to interpret those results to either identify what is increased risk should be adjusted. So traditionally, a hazard index of less than or equal to 1 is considered to be safe or acceptable for mixtures or multiple chemical exposures, but actually this is not correct, because evaluating combined phthalate exposures against a hazard index of 1 tacitly assumes that people are only exposed to those phthalates in a pristine environment with no other background exposures to any other chemicals or other stressors that may also contribute to the disruptions of male reproductive health. So this is clearly not the case. So we agree with arguments that have been presented along these lines by Kortenkamp and colleagues, in particular in their 2020 publication, where they make a recommendation about lowering the criterion for hazard index interpretation to a range of 0.1 to 0.2 as the benchmarks for interpreting a phthalate mixture's risk assessment results. Similarly, margins of exposures exceeding 100 to 1,000 have traditionally been considered adequate for protecting public health, but mainly for exposures to single chemical agents in isolation. And so these MOEs are generally considered acceptable because they represent, uncertainty factors that, might most likely be applied unless indication exists that it should be adjusted further due to concerns around highly vulnerable populations or population groups like women pregnant women and children. But there's no clear guidance on what an acceptable MOE would be for multiple chemical exposures, let alone joint exposures with non-chemical stressors. We say here that consideration should be given to increasing the MOE that would then be used to determine whether a cumulative phthalate exposure is sufficiently below a level of harm. Next slide. So how can results from a cumulative risk evaluation be used to inform the relevant policy question here, which is the risk determination? So in our paper, we also present a number of guiding questions that EPA could use to get to this decision. Here we focus on the last three, where we focus really on the final risk characterization. So one question EPA should be asking is then, what is the likely cumulative risk to humans based on both the quantitative results of the hazard index or the MOE calculations and qualitative descriptors for any added risk from other relevant chemicals and non-chemical stressors? And then based on that response, what's the recommendation? Is it a determination of unreasonable risk? Is it to seek more data, using their information gathering authorities, or no action at this time? And if that, whatever the recommendation is, and if that recommendation were implemented, would this affect the exposure to the 7 phthalates among the vulnerable population groups, and how? Next slide. So to wrap up here, our key messages are the cumulative risk evaluation for phthalates under TSCA is warranted, it's doable, and it would ensure that a final risk determination would be protective of public health. And while we, really focused on phthalates in this presentation, we believe that this approach can be used for other chemical exposures that might be undergoing TSCA risk evaluations. And I also want to emphasize that even if it becomes quite difficult to incorporate non-chemical stressors in the current risk evaluations for phthalates, EPA can and should at least conduct a cumulative risk assessment for the 7 phthalates themselves. Next slide. So I just want to give the acknowledgements here to our graduate research assistant that was very helpful in this activity, our funding support, and our disclaimer. And next slide, here are some references in support of what we just described. And I'll just end by saying thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Devon. I think if we could you can take the slides now. We've got great amount of time. We're not going to be rushed for Q&A, which is excellent. So maybe if all the panelists can come on. And I'll just remind folks as we're getting situated that you can use the question and answer function to put up questions. People have been putting up questions. Some of those have been answered, and I'll just flag a couple of basic ones, which is we've put up a link to the report and have noted that a recording of this session will be available there along with the slides. So let's get right into it. And I might start with kind of a high level question that came in as part of the first couple questions, which is this distinction in terminology. And we have all had these conversations as well, but particularly between a cumulative risk assessment or a cumulative impact assessment. Lariah, do you want to, I know in writing the report this was thought about a lot, do you want to talk about that, how we're thinking through that distinction in terminology?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's definitely no one best definition for cumulative risk or cumulative impacts. We decided to call our highest level cumulative impacts, which includes chemical and non-chemical stressors, to align with EPA's most recent cumulative impacts white paper, which the agency consulted on with the Science Advisory Board. So they include chemical and non-chemical stressors in their definition of cumulative impacts. So that was our distinction, but it's certainly not hard and fast. We know that other definitions of cumulative risk assessment do include those non-chemical stressors in their definition. So from where I'm standing, regardless of what it is called, I think as long as we're doing and implementing cumulative approaches, the terminology, call it whatever gets it done.
Devon, did you want to add at all to that?
Yeah, I just want to totally underscore that last point that Dr. Edwards mentioned. I think the point is we want to move forward away from, as much as possible, the status quo of, single agent, single chemical evaluations, because it's not reflective of reality. And we have so much data and information and evidence demonstrating that.
So I wonder, you've made the point, especially towards the end of your presentation, that this is doable. There is this notion that this may not be a fully new concept. So could you talk a little bit about, other programs potentially at EPA that have actually done cumulative risk assessment under a different program than the
Yeah, it's absolutely not a new idea or a new concept. I just do want to mention that, in fact, EPA started addressing this issue of chemical mixtures toxicity in the mid-1980s. But specifically with regards to how the agency has looked at cumulative risk, EPA has assessed cumulative risk from chemicals such as, as a group, PCBs, dioxins, metal compounds, coke oven emissions, disinfection byproducts, in drinking water. Cumulative risk assessments are routinely performed in the Superfund program, actually. And most recently, as I referenced in my presentation, EPA has developed guidance on assessing risk from mixtures of PFAS for drinking water.
Great, thank you. That's some good real world examples. We had a question in the Q&A box that whether this approach could be used to evaluate a full environmental health kind of status for a community, taking into account number of pollutant sources. So this is from Eric Nolan. Combining air emissions with lead in water, and whether how that fits into that approach. And this is getting, I think, a little bit into that distinction, right, between a risk assessment and an impact assessment. Dr. Payne-Sturges, you want to take that one?
Certainly, there's a lot of activities doing exactly that. I suppose the person who posed the question is familiar with the various mapping and screening methodologies out there for cumulative impacts. But I do want to come back to this question about the boundaries and the motivations. I think it's really important to be thinking about the biology here, and not to think about just adding everything just because you can, but to be thinking critically about the scope of that kind of an assessment. And I think really focusing on that common biological health outcome is an important organizing principle that people should keep in their minds when we're thinking about these cumulative assessments.
Another question, because I think there's been some comment, right, about this distinction, between where the non-chemical stressor component comes in, and I wonder if any of the panelists would like to weigh in on this question of where to get that, how that data may be available when we, if we're looking to do a fully inclusive assessment and include those non-chemical stressors. Professor Cory-Slechta, would you like to take that one? Or the panel's open, anyone can jump in on that one.
I will start. I think right now, clearly, some of the non-chemical stressors are going to be difficult to quantify explicitly. And I think that's been one of the not stumbling blocks, sort of the roadblocks to moving us forward. One of the ways I think of dealing with that right now might be to include it as part of the uncertainty factor assessment that goes on in risk assessment, in terms of applying some kind of uncertainty factor to your outcome that is based on maybe the interaction of that stressor with the chemicals that you're interested in. What's the magnitude of it? Is it a small magnitude effect? Is it a large magnitude effect if we know about the interaction? But that may be one of the ways, at least to begin to deal with that kind of a less quantitative non-chemical stressor.
Great. Lariah, did you want to jump in on that? I saw you come on.
Yeah. And so, reiterate what Dr. Payne-Sturges said, really, and, Dr. Debbie Cory-Slechta, trying to focus on the common biological health endpoint. I think that makes it seem, kind of grounds it, makes it seem a bit more approachable. And we recognize that this part is the hardest part, quantitatively trying to consider non-chemical stressors when they're called so many different names in literature, how to incorporate them. There's a lot of inconsistency and a bit of question left there. And so in the report, we address that, and we also include a list of resources that could be used to attempt to understand these non-chemical stressors. So highlighting some of the screening tools that Dr. Payne-Sturges mentioned, or using biomonitoring data, or there's a list of resources that are out there where you can find that data. But yes, we recognize it's a bit more complicated.
Yeah, and there were a number of other questions sort of related to this, and just in terms of how much data and data analytical support that would be needed to do this kind of approach. One commenter noted that if you don't know where the exposures are occurring or how much a chemical is produced, maybe in the context of new chemicals. Professor Cory-Slechta, I don't know if you want to add on to that. That question. There's a series of questions about that in terms of data analytical tools that may be used to as placeholders when you don't have as much data available.
I would point out that there are these neighborhood impact factors that have been generated. I don't have the URL right here with me, but there's been a lot of work looking at very specific and down deep at neighborhoods in terms of both chemical and non-chemical stressors. And I would encourage the use of a database like that to start including some of those kinds of, that might be one source of data that could be included in some of these analyses.
Great. There was a basic question. I want to make sure we address it because we may have a real mixed audience. Lariah, could you just explain again, when we say non-chemical stressor, what are we really, in layman's terms, what are we talking about?
Really, I feel like non-chemical stressors, we're talking about any factor that also biologically affects, the same endpoints as the chemical. And this, in the TSCA scenario, that is undergoing risk evaluation. So this could be experiencing discrimination. This could be experiencing lack of access to healthcare, violence. Really, it comes under this causing of stress that then could impact that exposure disease relationship. So I believe I highlighted an example in the paper that talked about women experiencing stress during pregnancy and also simultaneously experiencing exposure to phthalates, leading to then higher odds of preterm births. So when you think about non-chemical stressors, it can be a little bit squishy because we're putting it under this bucket of causing stress, and which makes it difficult to attempt to quantify.
Oh yes.
Yeah, add to that. So in the work that Debbie and I did, we cited evidence from the scientific literature on these non-chemical stressors and other health conditions that could make a person more vulnerable to the male reproductive tract developmental effects. And so it includes psychosocial stress, but also something like nutritional factors. In fact, low protein diet apparently has an impact. Something that Dr. Edwards just said about the multiple ways that stress can be defined or measured. I think that's part of also the challenge, because many studies may assess stress in very different ways. For example, like asking about very short-term experiences or acute experiences, Or is it really we should be thinking about stress as something that's more chronic, you know, like you say, like exposure to like living in poverty. So I think these are the things that, you know, thoughtful people need to come together and really try to address in for this situation, for really wanting to move forward on incorporating something like stress in a chemical risk assessment.
Just to build on that, I want to bring in a question from Charles Lee, which is about you know, the inclusion of including the process by which these non-chemical stressors are evaluated. And he's saying, you know, some may be outside the scope of that decision, and that the process of evaluating the stressors could raise expectations that they'll be addressed in some way. And so how do you manage expectations and bring in partners to try to address those stressors? You know, that's a big question. So I don't know who wants to take that one on, but it's an incredibly important one. Lariah, you want to take a first knock at that?
Yeah, I think what I heard is about raising expectations. So I like that phrase, and it leads me to think that if these stressors, these non-chemical stressors from, you know, the built, the natural, the social environment, they are going to be included in risk evaluations. I think that will then cause, you know, a convening or a coming together of a better way to assess them, to measure them, maybe a consistency in terminology that I think would really help push this forward and help address some of these questions we still have about how to consider them. So I think that's what I thought of, and that doesn't exactly answer that big question, but that's just a thought.
Anyone else want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll go back to the story of lead in kids many years ago, which was under the auspices of the CDC. And one of the things that they did in trying to deal with lead, which also has this cumulative impact kind of situation, was to bring to the Advisory Committee on Childhood Lead Poisoning Prevention representatives from other government agencies that could play a role here, so that there was some communication and some potential interactions that might help. I don't know how often that actually occurs, but at least it's one model. So something like those expectations may force more interactions amongst these government agencies that are dealing with these issues to try to resolve them.
I'm going to tee up two more questions to make sure that we end on time. So I'm just letting my panelists know that. The first is a more technical one. So some have argued that existing uncertainty factor for interhuman variability is sufficient to address those higher risks to vulnerable subpopulations and cumulative impacts. Can you all respond to that, or maybe Dr. Payne-Sturges, do you want to address that one, and we can go to the last question?
I like this one for Debbie.
Okay.
I don't know that we know that that covers the range of individual variability. In fact, people are starting to do some of those kinds of analyses right now and finding that isn't always the case, at least with some sets of data. So I'm not sure we actually know that that's the case. A lot of these uncertainty factors came out of the number of fingers we had more than any real biological information.
Great. And then we had a number of questions that I think is related to a really important consideration, which is how feasible is this for the TSCA program? They have a lot on their plate. They've had a lot to do, particularly over these past couple of years. You know, they've got tight deadlines. And I'll just flag, as you all think about the response to that, is that, you know, part of the reason we created these levels was to create a more accessible pathway, to not let, you know, perfection be the progress, what's the expression? But basically to be able to make some progress, even if it's not going to be perfect. Lariah, do you want to start off in terms of this feasibility question and whether EPA can really take this on or not?
Certainly, and I don't want to kind of throw under the rug the fact that we are asking for more. This is going to be more complicated and more time consuming, but it is better science to conduct cumulative risk assessments if the goal is to be protective and really for those potentially exposed and susceptible subpopulations. If that is the goal, then you are doing them a disservice by not doing it because you're underestimating risk. And so you're really not fulfilling what is mandated and what is to do. I'll let the other panelists chime in as well.
I completely agree with Dr. Edwards. And I mean, that was really the conclusion of our set of slides. The methodologies are there. At the least, EPA for the phthalates can do a cumulative risk evaluation.
And I agree with both Devon and Lariah on that score.
Great, thank you. And I think that for our part, we want to be supportive and making this progress happen. We know that there's been a lot of calls for many years to take these steps forward. And there's nothing like the urgency of now. And so we look forward to working with as many people to make that possible.